Coastal guards were unaware that this odd blue boat would soon become the focal point of a nightmare scenario when they intercepted it. None of their radars picked up the blue metallic vessel. Furthermore, there was little they could do to halt what happened when they entered the ship. But before we start our story, smash the like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. About 3 miles off the coast, during a normal inspection, the blue floating ship was noticed. The crew nearly passed it. At first, it appeared to be a speck on the horizon. But then one of the 7 coastal guards pointed and said, "Guys, there's something in the water over there." But the squad soon realized that the floating craft was far larger than they had first believed as their own boat approached. Their ship's radar did not seem to pick up the boat at all. It was a mystery boat. The captain of the crew looked at the monitor once more, but for some reason, it only showed their own ship. Its blue hue, which nearly merged in perfectly with the waves of the water, further enhanced this sensation. It made sense for the crew to call out the person operating the enigmatic boat in order to learn more. "Hey, the coastal guard is this. Is the individual inside the blue ship going to come out and say hello?" However, despite their repeated pleas, no one appeared to respond. There was a sense of tension in the air, and only by looking more closely could it be resolved. In order to bring the blue boat in, the team immediately threw a rope with a hook at the end toward it. However, that also did not exactly proceed as planned. Since the boat didn't appear to be very big, they should have been able to bring it close with a full crew of powerful pulling men. However, the enigmatic object refused to move. Instead, they were dragged forward in their own boat. "What is this thing?" The captain's voice was trembling. "This item is more complicated than it first appears." As their 2 ships eventually made contact, one of the crew members said, "We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg." However, the captain ordered him and a colleague to lead the inquiry, so this crew member would later come to regret saying this. The coastal guard assigned to the search, Brendan, was apprehensive, but he couldn't let his people down while they were watching. He approached the tiny top windows, carefully setting his first few steps on top of the blue boat. John, his partner, and a member of his crew joined him, and they attempted to look inside. The view via the little windows, however, seemed nearly black, so they offered little insight. Their only option was to do one thing. "We must open her up," Brendan told his pal. John concurred, and they raised the ship's hatch together. The boat's top hatch opened with a loud creak, revealing a staircase below. The fact that they couldn't see the bottom made them much more anxious. In the hopes that their captain would call them back, the 2 men gazed at him. However, the elderly sailor only encouraged them. "We're right here, so go ahead." Brendan retrieved a flashlight from his back pocket and used it to light up the area below. The 2 men would later come to bitterly regret their decision to dive down into the boat. When they reached the bottom, John and Brendan looked about with the flashlight. The interior of the ship appeared much more dilapidated than the appearance. "Who was the boat's pilot? Because no one is here," John said, perplexed. With the exception of the central console, which looked to have seen better days, everything seemed to be nothing but bare metal. With a shrug, Brendan attempted to share his discoveries with the outside team. Words were difficult to comprehend over Brendan's shaky walkie-talkie connection. However, things quickly became terrible. Above the 2 men, there was a creak, and then the top hatch abruptly closed by itself. When the captain and other crew members of the coastal boat noticed this, there was a generalized fear. They attempted to inquire about Brendan and John's well-being, but the closed hatch entirely cut off the contact signal. The 2 members of the investigation crew were separated from the rest of the group, and that was only the beginning of their trouble because the boat began to vibrate a lot right after that. John and Brendan ascended the ladder and gazed fearfully at their coastal vessel. What on earth is happening? Unfortunately, the blue boat had a mind of its own and was beginning to entirely descend beneath the ocean's surface, so it would be their only chance to see it. Despite his internalized panic, Brendan tried his hardest to calm his colleague down. "John, calm down. We are not sinking because the boat is not absorbing water." However, it appears that John was not calmed by this purposeful comment. "Who is doing this if it's deliberate?" Brendan tried to maintain his composure for as long as he could, but the 2 men soon fell into a panic. They banged their first into the ladder's metal hatch, but it would not budge. This was ineffective, and a few seconds later, the boat was fully underwater. And then a realization hit inside Brendan's brain. "This isn't just any boat. It is a submarine of sorts." John nodded and agreed with this thought, but that did not solve their dire situation. The two crew members desperately tried to communicate with the main boat, but the signal was completely dead. Brendan's mind returned to the time they had initially found that odd blue ship. Why, though, was this boat so stealthy? It was highly concealed by its blue color and filtered off all communication, so it did not appear on the radar. What was it used for? The submarine was heading to an unidentified site with serious repercussions, so the two terrified coastal guards would soon learn of it. However, John and Brendan had nothing to do except wait until then. They took advantage of this time to look for potential hints inside the submarine. The main console on the sub's north side was the first area they looked into. John, however, called out something at that point. With its sturdy buttons and cables going out back, it had the appearance of something from an 80s film. Nevertheless, it appeared that the machine had no influence over any area of the spacecraft. "Over here is a door, Brandon." Brandon looked at his companion as he turned around. They totally forgot about this portion in their panic. John was standing on the opposite side of the submarine, gesturing toward a large entryway that had a big metal handle attached to it. What might be the cause? In the hopes that their combined power would be sufficient to open this doorway, the two guys teamed up and began pushing the handle downward. However, this door appeared to be too strong for these two frantic guys to open, much as the hatch above. Just as Brendan and John placed their defeated bodies on the submarine floor, the boat started to vibrate intensely. It was the same vibration that occurred when they sunk down about 30 minutes ago, but this time they clearly went upward. "There's light coming through the top window," John stated excitedly. However, Brendan rapidly brushed this thrill aside as he began to realize that this whole voyage was unlikely to end well. Loud sounds came from above the submarine when it was completely above the ocean. "Someone is approaching, so run for cover," Brendan addressed his preoccupied co-worker. The two men jumped up from their seated position and hid behind the console on the other end of the boat. And right after they reached their hiding position, the hatch on top opened up. At that moment, three individuals climbed downward and made their way to the locked door. Brendan cautiously peered over the corner and watched how the dubious-looking people got into the submarine's sealed compartment without a single item. However, they were lugging heavy things as they came out. What was this location? What were they removing to? Brendan tried to make sense of everything, and his mind was racing. The men, who were big and heavy, carried dozens of heavy items to the surface on their frequent ascents and descents. Brendan and John were fortunate not to get caught during the roughly 30-minute operation. That did not, however, mean that the two coastal guards were safe. It was silent inside the submarine after the dubious men had finished unloading its contents. John and Brendan were afraid to talk. However, they both saw that the people had left the ship's upper section open. They both understood that this was their opportunity to get away. Knowing what to do, the two guys ascended the ladder, Brendan at the head of the pack. The coastal laborers felt the cool ocean breeze on their faces as they alighted from the boat at the top. However, it was not all because both men were immediately taken aback by the boat's location. There was no land around. They were in the middle of the ocean. On top of them, however, was a huge oil rig platform supported by 4 enormous floating pillars. "Where in hell have we gone with this ship?" John's voice was trembling. Brendan and John carefully climbed the long ladder that connected the submarine to the main platform above, and once they got there, a huge surprise awaited them. There was much activity on top of the oil platform. Workers were lifting boxes, and machines were transporting cargo from left to right. John and Brendan worked together to try to figure out their next course of action while remaining concealed behind some big shipping containers. It was evident right away that no oil drilling was taking place here. However, what was this floating deck used for? The two men moved around the area with tact and discretion. They came close to being captured a couple of times. On one occasion, John stumbled on a loose wire, and 2 employees looked back and almost saw them. Ultimately, however, they were able to get across the platform without being noticed. They finally got to see the main event as a result of all this skulking around. As they crouched behind a big container, Brendan noticed an elderly man who looked to be in his mid-60s. John muttered, "He must be the leader." Compared to the other people on the station, he was well dressed, and the three people from earlier positioned the pile of bulky parcels in front of the elderly man's feet. They observed how the leader removed a substantial pile of cash from one of the bundles after cracking apart the foil covering it. John and Brendan were aware that illegal activity was taking place when they witnessed this. But in this case, Brendan and John were stranded and all alone. The only thing they could do now was observe. They watched how the leader lifted his hand and signaled for something in the back to be brought forward. An equally large package arrived from the back and was placed beside the money. This parcel was stuffed with a knife, and the contents adhered to the blade. The two coastal guards' eyes doubled in size because they were familiar with this stuff. They confiscated several illicit substances in their capacity as coast guards, and this was unquestionably a sort of powdered drug. However, the amounts they saw today were completely different from what they were accustomed to. Brendan weighed about 4 pounds at his largest bust. However, this one stack alone must have been 5 times as large. In the back, there was likely a lot more.